just in terms of transforming the advocacy space in Seattle. I can't think of anyone who's been able to sort of reframe the conversation around transportation and mobility in the past couple of years. So I don't think we need to introduce, you need to give more of an introduction than what you gave before, but I'm going to hand the floor over and then start back up with a Q&A after hearing from her.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. And I'm going to paste a link in the chat. This is the PowerPoint. It's not a long PowerPoint, but I like images. So that is that. And I will be sharing that momentarily on the screen. I'm also going to paste a couple other links that I'll be referring to, and you guys are welcome to check those out. All right, let's see if I can get this to work now. Still haven't fully figured out the multiple monitors and screen sharing. But all right, let me know if that's working. I'm going to take silence as a yes. All right, so Anna Zivarts here, and I am the director of the Disability Mobility Initiative. We are a program or project within Disability Rights Washington, which is a statewide organization that works in disability rights, disability justice. And this is a photo of me. I grew up in Olympia, Washington. I've been low vision my entire life. I have an eye condition called nystagmus that makes my eyes sort of dance and bop around my head. It's a neurological condition. They don't fully understand how it works, but it's meant that I haven't been able to drive. But I did have a mom, and this is a picture of my mom and me on Cooper Point Road in Olympia, me learning how to bike. I had a mom who was a big biker herself, and she made sure that I learned how to bike and had a real sense of independence and mobility and the importance of that. And so that's how I grew up. Let's see. Okay, there we go. And so growing up in Olympia, on the outskirts of Olympia, not in the transit network, definitely a sense of isolation, especially as I hit high school and my friends all became drivers. And so I left Washington State and I moved to New York City after college, and spent close to 12 years based out of New York City, but traveling a lot for work. I did video production work for labor unions. And so spent a lot of time in other parts of the country meeting with locals who were doing organizing work. And these are some photos from some of those trips. I usually would be by myself. And so I'd be flying somewhere, staying in a hotel on a strip somewhere, and trying to figure out how to walk to get dinner that evening down situations like these photos. I think the left one is me on a highway in LA. The right one, I believe, is in Ohio somewhere. And so saw a lot of the country that way, and also interacted with a lot of other non-drivers in the context of both the workers, the service workers that were part of the unions or trying to be part of the unions, and then just other folks who were out there waiting at bus stops, walking down roads like this. And so I, had this sort of political identity formed, but I didn't have a real concrete place of, or a sense of how I could take that and use that to create change. I did, when I was in New York, get involved a bit with the Families for Safe Streets, which was an advocacy group that was just forming at that point around pedestrian deaths. This was a rally that I shot photos for this 3-year-old Allie who was killed crossing the street with her grandma. A lot of really heart-wrenching, heartbreaking vigils and activism around pedestrian safety. But it felt really hard and really draining for me to be in that space, and not something that I could sustain. And so eventually I ended up back in Washington State. Part of that was because I had a kid and I wanted to be closer to family. My partner's family is also from here. And I ended up back at Disability Rights Washington, leading their video team, which is called Rooted in Rights. And at Rooted in Rights, we started making a lot of videos about transportation and transportation access, which is where I think I met a lot of you guys. On the left is a photo of a screenshot of a tweet from AOC, who shared one of the videos we made around snow and access to sidewalks after snow. This photo on the right is a photo by David Cedar, who took it of one of the actions we did around the I-90 and Rainier ramps, trying to get some pedestrian safety improvements there. And I think everyone on my team got really sick of working on transportation stuff. And so as the pandemic sort of shifted everything around, I had the opportunity, and I convinced the leadership at DRW to let me launch the Disability Mobility Initiative, which is why isn't this letting me do this? The organizing project that I do now. And so it is an organizing project because that's my background, is organizing, working for many, many years in labor unions and learning a lot from the organizers in those spaces. I wanted to do something that brought together the voices of non-drivers from around our state, because I knew we were out there and yet we weren't, present in a lot of these conversations. And, I think a lot of what we do as a Disability Mobility Initiative is trying to be visible. The other part of my background was I worked for the Lgbtq and HIV/AIDS project at the ACLU in 2008, 2009, 2010, and learned from the brilliant leaders and attorneys on that team who were really trying to shift the conversation around, at that point, it was marriage and adoption, but generally just, humanizing some of the cases and taking what was a situation that felt very impossible. And within a really short couple of years, that conversation really changed pretty dramatically. And learning how to go out and try to figure out what are the stories, who are the people that are going to move that conversation? What are those stories? And then I sort of took that background from it's not just about finding the stories, it's actually about finding the people and helping them become involved and become advocates for their work. And so we've done the story map now. We're up to close to 200 stories. Kimberly's on this call tonight. She's done a tremendous amount of work on that. She also really pushed me to make it a more formal, we had all these interviews and all this knowledge, and she really pushed me to sort of formalize that into a research paper, which is our Transportation Access for Everyone research paper here. You can see that on the screen. It's very long, it's very in-depth, comes with a lot of stories and a lot of recommendations. And that has really opened the doors to some other conversations in places that I don't think, we would have been welcome before, places like AASHTO, and a lot of sort of government agencies that hadn't really thought about the needs of non-drivers in such a concrete way. And the other really exciting and wonderful thing that we've done in the last 18 months or so since launching Disability Mobility Initiative is the Week Without Driving. Some great participation from elected leaders, from transit agency folks, from the public. And so we're going into this year, probably organizing it again for the fall and figuring out how to grow it and how to build more participation from everyone. So that's sort of a big picture of where we are. We've also had a really wonderful partnership with Front and Centered, with 350, with Transit Riders Union, Washington Bus, growing coalition of groups that are really standing up and working together to frame the work we do, in particular the advocacy work we do at the state level, in the context of a just transition. So it's not just about what we can win in this moment. It's about making sure that we don't create more harm and perpetuate systems that are creating that harm. And so I think that connects pretty well to the work we can talk about tonight with this legislative session and what's been going on. So having some mouse issues here. Sidewalks are another big piece of that. And I can get into that more. Crystal Montero's pictured here is an advocate from Tacoma who's talked a lot about the importance of really thinking of sidewalks as part of our transit network. And I think that's a concept that's starting to really catch on in broader transportation spheres right now. And so making sure that perspective is included. And then that we just need to have more non-drivers, more disabled non-drivers, more low-income non-drivers, more immigrant non-drivers, more formerly incarcerated non-drivers. We need all of us at the table in these conversations so that we can design better systems and so that our voices are included and really, really fundamentally listened to. And so we're doing some work around driver's license requirements for jobs, working with the governor's office on that. We also have a study that we're hopefully will be funded through the supplemental transportation budget on understanding the demographics of non-drivers, because there's a lot of questions about, do we really exist to the extent that we say we do? And so those are some of the other projects that we are working on right now. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing. I have some other slides with some more stories I can share later, but I want to make sure that this is a conversation. And so take questions. And I'm good to go.
Yeah, that was such a great presentation. I'm really excited to dig into these issues. I want to start asking you, since we're at the Urbanist, and sort of how you engage with what's called traditional urbanism. I think we kind of, always focus on the sort of twin issues of transportation and land use, but I think the land use has always been sort of focused on a kind of a city center perspective. And as someone who is working on these issues from all over the state, and you've been all over the country sort of dealing with these mobility issues, how do you sort of view the sort of traditional abundant housing movement and its intersections with the transportation sphere?
Yeah, that's a great question, and so complicated too, right? I mean, I think, as we talk to folks around the state, for many people, the dream is to live within walking or rolling distance of a light rail station, right? Like that is like, oh my God. But the reality is that most people, especially folks on fixed income, SSI, like they can't afford it, right? And so that's not where folks are living. And so there's the affordability piece, which you guys all, are well familiar with, is how do we make it more affordable for folks to live near light rail. But then there's also a lot of folks who are out there in more rural or suburban areas who, because that's where their family support networks are. And that's, a critical part of their care, and their daily, needs gets met through that. Or, it's where they've been their entire lives. And that's this wonderful woman named Nancy, who we visited out in the Wishkah Valley. I made my dad drive me out there. It's like north of Aberdeen, just up this valley. And she can't drive anymore. She lives with a couple of sons that she's adopted through the foster care system, who are also non-drivers. And yet, for her, this like rural way of life isn't an identity. It's something that's really important. And I think that is something that we can respect and figure out, ways to allow people to still be connected. Even though for me, like, my gut reaction growing up in, the woods was get me out of here, get me to a city. I want to live in a city. But that's not everyone. And just because you can't drive, I think, doesn't mean you have to live in a city. Perhaps that transit isn't going to be as frequent. Well, obviously it's not going to be as frequent, but it's still possible for our rural communities to be connected for non-drivers. There's another example of someone too who his name is Kevin, and he lives in rural Mason County near Shelton, and he has the same exact eye condition I do, and he's older than me, retired, has kids and grandkids, and we were chatting, and I was kind of appalled because he's someone who could afford to live somewhere more connected. And I was like, why would you move? Why do you live in Shelton? And he's like, I want to live on a lake. I want to go fishing. And this is how I can do that. And so, I think that it's also important to recognize that that people should have the opportunity to live these more rural places, and that we can still provide, in Mason County, there's free transit. That's like an on-demand paratransit style transit system, and that can work for people. But we just need to make sure to have those services.
What do you see the legislature as being able to do, make headway in terms of improving access? I know that the transportation package includes some rural access grants, but I guess what's being done to kind of correct those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about, Front and Center has been pushing a WSDOT study on a frequent transit standard for the state. And I think that's one way to get there, right? Is to start to think about, okay, what is reliable transit? And it's not going to look the same everywhere, but starting to like have that basic minimum and starting to figure out how we can get that met. And so there aren't, like if you look at in PSRC's regional transportation plan, they've done a lot of work and they've mapped out, right, like where transit service is in the PSRC region. And you look at Pierce County compared to King County or Kitsap County or Snohomish County even, and like especially weekend service, like there's just so much of Pierce County that's totally white. It has no service. And the same is true for paratransit service. So if you live in any of those areas, you're out of luck. You are, if you can't drive, you are relying on friends and family, basically. And we have to figure out how to fix that, because it's not as simple as just like, oh, well, the voters are going to approve a measure. It shouldn't be the case that if you live in an area that has a voter base that doesn't support transit, that you don't get transit.
Staying a little bit on the urbanism topic, I know advocates for car-free spaces often sort of encounter the argument that car-free spaces are shutting people out, not allowing disabled people to access spaces, and sort of used as a I think that kind of came up a lot on talking about Lake Washington Boulevard, and San Francisco with Golden Gate Park. And so I'm wondering how you navigate sort of that whole issue.
Yeah, I mean, starting with Lake Washington Boulevard, like the path that's along there right now, that quote unquote sidewalk, which is controlled by the park. I don't know if y'all tried to go on it with a stroller or running or with a bike. It is so cracked up to the point of being fully inaccessible. Like some of those root humps are, so right now it's not accessible to folks in wheelchairs or with strollers or blind folks who would, easily trip on many of those really bumpy sidewalks. And so I get frustrated. That's part of the conversation. I think we do need to, recognize that there are people for whom being in a vehicle is, how the easiest way right now for them to get around. And that's because we've designed systems for vehicles to be, the easiest way for people with limited ability to get around. In Golden Gate Park, I have a friend, Maddie Rugolo, who is a planner with SFMTA, who's been working on that project from the disability perspective. And I think, there are, like, we've sort of worked ourselves into these boxes where everything that is in a car isn't accessible for folks with limited mobility. Or if it is, it's like a really expensive adaptive bike. And instead of, all that venture capital money that's gone into scooters and e-bikes, instead of going into inclusive design solutions to make these things more accessible, to make e-wheelchairs, power wheelchairs more accessible, right now they're super expensive because the scale just isn't there. And, venture capital is not interested in making that work for people. What if all that money had gone into making smaller, more human scaled, accessible transportation solutions? And I don't know, that's where I'm like outside and enjoy the fresh air. And right now that's just not feasible for many folks because the car is the only option they have for mobility. Digging
into the statewide transportation funding conversation, I'm wondering if you can, start talking about Move Ahead Washington, talk a little bit about how you've seen how lawmakers are viewing the transportation package and funding discussion since you've been advocating on Olympia.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually freaking out today because I was like, this is the worst possible timing for a presentation on the Move Ahead Washington plan, because we know there's a plan out there and it's not going to be public for 24 hours. And I don't have my fingers in the inner workings of things well enough to know, what's in it. So I wish I could tell you all. I don't know. I think, what we've seen so far, that conversation, what sort of amazes me, and what I'm gonna focus on the positive for a minute. When I started working in transportation in the legislature, it was on Block the Box stuff, and it was in 2019. And Tim Eyman got to speak first, and he got to speak for like 10 minutes for public comment, and all this banter with other, folks on the transportation committees. And it was, I think both in the House and the Senate. And, everyone else was, time chopped off, blah, blah, blah. And he was setting the tone of those conversations. And that's really changed. He's still obviously organizing in other spaces, but I think the transportation space, because of the organizing work we've done and the coalition we've started to build, that's shifted. And so now, now everyone is wanting to talk up multimodal spending now, and especially, as gas prices are going up, it's like, oh, look what we're doing for the voters. So I think that conversation has shifted. We're not totally there. Of course, we would love a package that, didn't have any of the highway expansion in it. That's not, I don't imagine that's what we're going to see tomorrow, but we have made incredible progress, and, we've got to keep organizing though, obviously.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how Week Without Driving actually came about, and what the reaction from lawmakers and local electeds has been.
Yeah, I mean, it was inspired for me, I definitely have seen whatever the bike month challenges, but for me, it really came from filming, being asked to film some day in the life of a housekeeper videos for unions. And I remember spending a day with then candidate Muriel Bowser from DC, and a housekeeper who worked at the Marriott. And we met at the housekeeper's house. And I remember we got on a bus, and then we had to transfer to the DC Metro, and we had to pay again. It was like a 2-fare trip. And I remember I think, I was shocked because I was like, coming from New York, that was just horrifying to me from an equity perspective that you'd be doing that. And I think she was surprised as well. And it made me realize that there was this power in people actually understanding what it was like to spend a day with someone else, understanding their commutes. And so that's where it came from. And we, played around with the idea, decided a week was, why not? Let's try to do a week. And I think we'll try to figure out how to do it again this year in a way that we get increased participation. I think it was, we were trying to organize it sort of as a rush last year because we thought there might be a special session for the transportation package, and we wanted to make sure to get it in before that. This year, we'll have a lot more planning and ability to do outreach and really get engagement from, hopefully, electeds from every community in the state.
So yeah, what were some of the reactions you got from lawmakers this year?
Yeah, I mean, I was just actually spent the afternoon trying to pull the clip of Rep. Wicks from the floor where she was talking about her experience doing that. And thanks, Ryan, for notifying me to that, because I would not have caught that. But, I think I remember one of her comments in particular was that she had to take off a pair of heels to walk down this steep, muddy slope to get to a sidewalk, and just how sort of humiliating and what it made her realize about, what it takes to try to navigate some of these spaces that aren't designed to become. That was a great one. I mean, gosh, there was so many. Yeah.
Kind of related to that is I'm wondering what is kind of the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing it is to get electeds to realize about people who aren't able to drive in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this goes back to Week Without Driving and some things I heard from, I think it was Claudia Balducci and Senator Saldana, where, a lot of people, especially, progressive people who live closer in, do ride transit, and they do ride bikes on occasion. But the trips they choose to do those for are the trips where it's easy. And it's those other trips where it's not easy that non-drivers, have to make that they hadn't had to make before. And so, I think it was groceries or dance class in the dark and the rain, or dance, kid needing to do this activity on this side of town and other kid needing to do that activity on that side of town, things that either you would just have to sort of suck it up and spend, all Sunday getting groceries, for example, or you just wouldn't do. And I think there's a lot of, just not doing that happens, and a lot of isolation, because it becomes such a hassle and so difficult for people to get out and connect. And, we've all been through the pandemic and recognized how harmful that really is for most of us, for our mental health, to have that kind of isolation.
Earlier you mentioned the Puget Sound Regional Council and their transportation plan. You're someone who's navigating all of the different levels of what I like to call the transportation ecosystem. And it seems really inaccessible for anybody. And I'm wondering how you sort of are able to help people navigate all the different levels of government it takes to just get things done in transportation.
Oof, yeah. I mean, I started with SDOT, right, in the city of Seattle, and that felt pretty manageable. And, with the support of the Mass Coalition and really learning the ropes from people who have been doing it for a while, that was helpful. And then, with disability mobility, we've really been focused at the state level and with WatchDOT in the legislature. And so learning a lot, still learning about that process. And I hadn't really dug my teeth into PSRC and the MPOs until, the sort of the big chunk of federal funding, and a lot of it's going to get filtered down through these MPOs. And I recognize that, all right, I should understand this a little more so we can start to make sure perhaps that we get some of this funding going to the projects that we need, because it is really going to be places like PSRC where those decisions are going to get made. And it is not a transparent or easy process to engage with. So I do encourage you all. The hearing is on Thursday for the regional transportation plan. You should show up and testify if you have thoughts. And I think Ryan's written a bit about, what is happening with that. But I'm also happy to share more thoughts offline. And our letter that we've been asking for, we're asking for a series of amendments around additional focus on sidewalk connectivity and ADA compliance in this, it's supposed to be a plan through 2050, right? And so it's like, oh, I think if we can't even comply with the ADA by 2050, I don't know, what we're doing. So yeah, I do think, and there's so many, there's all the federal stuff that I honestly haven't had the capacity to dig into and fully understand, and maybe someday, but not this year, probably.
Yeah, I know you mentioned on Twitter kind of wanting to create a sidewalk caucus in the legislature, perhaps as a contrast to the ferry caucus. It seems hard to get lawmakers to kind of care about these kind of basic things that they take for granted.
Yeah, no, I saw some tweet about the ferry caucus, and I was like, it's kind of exciting. I mean, it was one of the things that we were sort of floating going into this legislative session is, what if we need to create more of a work group around sidewalks and trying to figure out, okay, there's a lot of, competing jurisdictions, gaps in jurisdictions, who's responsible, private property owner responsibility, trying to sort through all that and figure out what, are there laws that need to change, or is it really just about funding? And if we're actually serious about a connected statewide sidewalk network, how do we get there? So that was, I think some of that work is the conversation is going to get started in the Cooper-Jones Active Transportation Council. So that's exciting, because there's, I think, support for that, some staff support and some excitement to move things forward there. So that'll be one place. I was hoping for a more formal sort of sidewalks caucus, but I think, something to aspire to next year, perhaps.
Since we're on that topic, we have a submitted question by Barbara that I'm going to read. What are your thoughts about what the city of Seattle, I assume, should do about the 26% of Seattle lacking sidewalks, but allows vehicles parked on the road, shoulders, pedestrian right of way, as well as any manner of obstructions, fences, vegetation, open ditches, while pedestrians scramble to get out of the way of vehicles?
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a huge issue. And it's always, oh, there's not funding. And then there's not the political will too. Right. And, I live in a neighborhood in South Seattle where a lot of the non-arterials, these neighborhood streets, don't have sidewalks. And it can be fine if you're an able-bodied person, but if you're blind, it can be really tricky to navigate. If you're with a kid, you suddenly have a lot more fear because they're not sort of contained in this sidewalk where they're going to be safe. Like they could, be, it just feels a lot more dangerous to be in even a slow street without the sidewalks. The Greenway through South Seattle, Renton, near my house doesn't have sidewalks, and that's supposed to be the main bike ped route. So that's frustrating. And then you have parts of North Seattle, right, that don't have sidewalks and arterials. We met a kid this summer. He was a fellow with me briefly, who got services at Ryther, which is a big youth service agency. And it's on 95th Street and Lake City Way. And there's no sidewalks between the bus stop and this place where all these youth go to, get support. And a lot of them, don't drive right now and may never drive. And to not have that kind of connected, accessible way for them to get that, that was frustrating. And actually, I think Rep Wicks went there sorry. Hey, Casper, I'm on a call. Rep Wicks went there for a meeting during Without Driving. And that was actually one of the places that she really struggled because that sidewalk was missing. So in that particular place, we are working with SDOT to try to figure out if we can get a design to figure out, how much it would be to get that sidewalk built along that block. But that's just one block of 95th, right? And there's a lot more, and there's a lot more arterials out there.
I feel like that's a really good illustration of the way that your work intersects with the pedestrian safety crisis that we've just continue to see on our streets. You sit on the Cooper Jones Active Transportation Safety Council, which I should mention, if anyone's unaware, it's a statewide body set up by the Traffic Safety Commission that oversees active transportation safety specifically. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you see happening there to address that safety crisis.
Yeah, I mean, Cooper Jones for me has been a real learning process and sort of figuring out, how these conversations happen at the state level with agencies, with local city governments. There's a lot of folks at the table in that space, which is awesome. I think one of the pieces that I was most excited about and most involved with, because the work happens sort of within work groups, is a work group that looked at the issue of safety beyond just crashes and what does it mean, and thinking, much more broadly about what does it mean to feel safe? So, thinking about policing, thinking about, the dark, thinking about harassment, thinking about, what is a comfortable and enjoyable place to walk or roll, and starting to think about how this work group could tackle those issues as well and not be focused sort of on just when people get killed or seriously injured in crashes, which is part of it, right? And a critical part of it, but also the conversation is bigger than that, because there's a lot of things that prevent people from being able to move the way they want to move in their communities, that aren't just that getting hurt, getting killed piece.
Staying on safety for a second, we have another question from Richard that's getting into the weeds a little bit again with the PSRC. Question is there hope or promise that a coalition of PSRC Transportation Policy Board members might propose a safety and access amendment to the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan?
Yeah, you know what? I know there's a list of amendments, and I have just dug into the one that related to our ask. So I haven't had a chance to look in there in a lot of depth, but I know there are a group of folks that are working to propose some amendments, and hopefully those get passed.
I know our May Meetup guest, Claudia Balducci, has been pushing very hard on that issue, yes. Kind of on a level that I really haven't seen from anyone in terms of in the weeds on that sort of policy. It's kind of, it's just impressive. Side note.
Yeah, no, she's been, I think her and her staff have really been key in convening the group of folks to make sure that these amendments get submitted. And this isn't just another sort of regional plan that gets, signed off on without really making it as good as it can be.
Going to go to a couple more questions here. This question is just, how can people with disabilities change the system? Simple question, hard answer, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I do really believe it's about organizing. And that's, because of my background, like, I think it's, we all read stuff or, have ideas about how to make the world better. But it doesn't matter if we know we're right. And even if we have the right ideas, like, it really does become about building that coalition and building a narrative or a consensus around what needs to change. And then, creating the environment for that to happen. And so I do believe in, in that organizing and understanding what is going on is part of that. And that's why I love the Urbanist, because I think the work that you all do and the reporting and these conversations, it's not possible to get in the weeds and be taken seriously in these rooms unless you have or start to have some baseline of knowledge about the system. Lived experience is awesome, but it's also pretty easy to be tokenized. And so how do you know enough about what's going on, even if it's still a learning process? How do you know enough about what's going on so that you can really start to figure out where the points are where you can make a difference?
You had mentioned sort of the legislature using the investments as a counterpoint to the conversation about gas prices. Someone asked how this anticipated increase in gas prices impact the need for Move Ahead Washington.
Yeah, I mean, luckily, there are some pretty significant investments in transit and in grants for bike and ped safety projects. So, that will help, right? There's also in the maintenance section, maintenance and preservation, there's some language around complete streets. And so, this is something that we're going to have to stay on top of. But in theory, anytime WashDOT touches a project or road to repair it, in the same way that right now they would need to install ADA ramps, they would actually need to do an analysis and evaluate, whether it needs bike lanes or sidewalks, and if it does, put those in. And so that could be big. For example, in places like Aurora, you see places like there are curb ramps and no sidewalks, and that's because that doesn't exist currently. And so if that exists, then not only is there the mandate to do it, there's also the funding to do it that's coming out of that maintenance and preservation budget. So that's cool. Because, in Seattle, we see it less. There's less highways other than Aurora, that are sort of pedestrian accessible highways. But in other parts of the state and other communities, the downtowns of these more rural communities are the state highway. And it's often then that community that is responsible for the sidewalk, and they may or may not have the resources to do that. So this is a pot of, this is potentially a resource to make those changes.
I know a lot of those issues were highlighted, sort of the lack of pedestrian facilities on state highways was highlighted through the new active transportation plan, which I'm sure was a big resource for your work. It's been for mine. Can you talk a little bit about how you've used that plan?
Yeah, no, I think it's terrific to see that happening. I think the level of stress analysis is sort of a new way to think about how we measure streets. I think, like the success of a street formerly was, right, how many vehicles you could move, that vehicle throughput. And so starting to think about, okay, maybe that's not the only metric. Maybe that it shouldn't be a metric at all. What other metrics can we use? And, I don't think level of stress is perfect, but I think it's a really interesting way to start to think about, being along a street or trying to cross a street and what that means for folks. And so excited to see that. And just, I mean, Washington, I think, really is a leader on this, as much as we all like to dig in and push for more. I have recently started doing bike ped assessments for NHTSA as a learning process. And they wanted someone to come in and provide an accessibility perspective to these. And so we just finished one for Kentucky, and I'm starting one for the state of Maryland. And it's just like, seeing the work that's happening in Washington around accessibility and equity, it is often in these spaces, right, the leading edge. And so that's pretty cool to have seen that happen here and have that foundation to work with.
Let's talk a little bit about your work on pushing back on the sort of the mega projects, the highway expansion projects. I know your org kind of took a different tactic for the past couple of sessions in terms of not supporting a transportation package that included a large amount of new money for expanded highways. Can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at that position?
Yeah. I mean, so at like a fundamental level, I left the state because I worked on against a Tim Eyman initiative in high school. And I very fundamentally understood at that point at some level that like, this was a state that wasn't at that point, and this was like in 1999, 2000, right? Not gonna be a place where people people who couldn't drive felt supported. And so I was like, peace, y'all, I'm going to New York City. And I had the privilege to do that. I want my son to have a choice to stay here. And unless things start to, unless we really are investing in transit and sidewalks everywhere, that's not going to be an option for him. And so, that's sort of where it came from. I think I also then, having been involved in this way early, anti-Tim Eyman campaigns, I was super excited to work on the 976 effort to defeat that. That was his last transit one, and car tabs. And I got super frustrated when the powers that be and the consultants in that space decided the messaging was all going to be about bridges and highways. And I was like, let's talk about the people who are really going to be impacted by this. Let's actually be direct about why, rather than trying to sort of satisfy this, what is presumed to be the narrative around who votes for transit. And so, and that campaign didn't work, right? They lost. So I was like, you know what? This clear, this message isn't working and we're not getting what we need. And I was like, you know what, it's time to go. It's time to be a little braver and actually push harder, because we're not going to get better things unless we ask for more. And I think, a lot of things have changed. We've done a lot of organizing, and we've seen a real shift in what was offered this time around, because we weren't just okay with the crumbs. So I think it's working. And, it's been tremendous to see that it's not just DRW, it's front and center, it's 350, it's urban. This is a coalition that's building, that we don't just have to be okay with whatever the Democrats offer us. Like,
a related question on highway expansion from Brandon here. How do you pitch multimodal transportation to more rural communities where leaders might associate highway expansion with economic?
Yeah, the growth thing. I think I sound like I'm going to parrot Roger Millar here, Secretary Millar, for a second, but I think there are really strong arguments to be made around the need for preservation and maintenance. First, because we're in such a hole there. And I think it was actually Rima Griffith from the Transportation Commission was saying, God, it was like by 20, and I'm going to not remember the year, but I think it was like in the next 10 years or 20 years, we'll be paying 67 cents out of every dollar to the gas tax to debt service for previous road projects, right? Like it's not just that we can't afford, that we can't afford new projects. We can't afford the projects that we built. The debt is something we're going to pass on to our kids. And that's terrible. So there's that. And I think that there's also the opportunity of job creation through multimodal work is also something that Secretary Miller talks about. And, I'm not an expert in this, but, it does, like, the opportunity to build sidewalks and transit and multi-use trails. Those actually create more jobs and more local jobs that aren't going to big firms that have the big fancy machinery to build highways. They can go to, firms with less capital and less resources in that front. So in some ways, it's a more equitable way to do transportation.
I have a question from Salwa here asking about taking disability rights project to a more local scale, looking at the Snoqualmie Valley. Any advice to model what you're doing for somewhere like that?
And I think that's awesome. I mean, if I had a choice, I would be doing this work at a very local level. Like, I'd be doing it in my local district. I think it's that building those relationships and really knowing folks in your community, that is going to make a real difference, and starting, with the local decisions that are getting made. So really exciting to hear that. And that's yeah. And if people think there aren't disabled folks or aren't non-drivers in your community, I guarantee you're missing folks. And perhaps because there's a lot of shame out there around not driving, a lot of stigma for folks who may have been able to drive before, a lot of just dismissal of the needs for youth to be able to get themselves around. Like, there are folks out there. And as you start to dig a little deeper into what people's barriers and needs are for living the lives they want to live, this will surface.
And there's a question from Peter. Says, folks in the story map talk about fixed route versus flexible or paratransit. Can you talk a little bit about the range of preferences that people you work with have for different types of public transit?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a range, right? For some folks, paratransit, getting that door-to-door service is the only, is what's going to be accessible to them. Often, folks, some folks need that assistance from their doorstep, and paratransit can offer that in a way that fixed route transit, can't. There's also folks out there, right, who would love to be able to use a fixed route bus, but there isn't one that is close enough to them, or, the hours don't work, or for example, the transfer, they can't safely transfer at to a different fixed route bus that they would need to, because that transfer point isn't accessible or safe, or there's not a sidewalk. I mean, and what we hear all the time is that there's not a sidewalk or an accessible crossing near their house for them to get, even though there is a bus, they can't get to it safely. And so, we need paratransit, and where there isn't paratransit, we need all the community shuttles and volunteer programs and, all the other ways that people, medical transport, patch together mobility in areas that are further out, and not covered by paratransit or transit. And then we also need better transit, because I think for a lot of people, not having to pre-schedule something is hugely beneficial. And that flexibility and ability to do last minute trips is great.
Got time for one more question from Mahad, asking, how can we provide immigrants who do not speak English with affordable transit options?
Yeah, no, I think this is really, really important. I mean, one thing I wish, I think the conversation around fare free transit is important, because, even what for some folks is like a small amount of money, for other folks, that's significant. And that is a barrier to getting, where you need to go, or making as many trips as you want to make. I mean, every day when I ride the 7, I see people paying in loose change, right? Even despite all the programs that King County Metro is trying to offer to subsidize transit, right? People are still paying in loose change. And some people can't pay, and, the drivers are great, but HopeLink, also HopeLink Mobility, I know, is mostly on the east side. of Lake Washington at the east side of the mountains, does a lot of really great work with training folks who are recently immigrated and you know, speak other languages other than English on how to use transit for the first time and be comfortable using transit. And so there's work happening in that space too, which is exciting. And yeah, check out their stuff.
I think that's all of our questions. Thanks so much for this great conversation. Any final words you have?
Man, no, there's a lot of questions. Thanks, Ryan. That was a great interview. And yeah, I haven't been able to read the chat. So if you message me in the chat, I will try to download that now and respond to you later. Apologies. It's not something I can do while I'm doing this. So thank you. Thank you all. I can also paste my contact info in the chat. And then if you want to reach out to me afterwards with a question or whatever, you are welcome to do that. I will put my email there. And yeah, we will all be furiously going through the transportation package tomorrow afternoon, whenever it comes out. And, you know, I mean, I guess one last thing, and just one of the organizers that I worked with for many years, I was really depressed at one point around some campaign that we lost and, you know, how hard we tried. And he was like, you know, you can't do this work if winning is the point. Like, you have to be able to enjoy the fight. Otherwise, like, you're not going to be in it for the long haul. And so, yeah, I am actively working to make this work that I can, you know, that I can do and enjoy and have it be sustainable for the long haul. And I encourage you all to, yeah, just remember that, but in some ways the point is the fight. And in having this fight and having these conversations, we are changing the narrative, and that's, you know, that is winning. So thank you guys.
Great note to end on. I'm going to hand it over to Doug for any final words here.
I did post the Action Network in the chat. It has over 1,700 signatures. So add yours if you'd like to send a message to state legislators to, you know, keep the multimodal projects whole and try to balance it by, you know, finding good new revenue or cutting highway projects, preferably. It sounds like it might be a model toxic act funds, which had been set aside for brownfield cleanup. So not ideal, but maybe they think there's enough money there to play around with. Thanks so much for joining us, Anna, and thanks everyone else too for following these issues and tuning in.